When a waitress refuses a tip that could pay her rent, the manager threatens to fire her on the spot. But then the poor man at her table stands up, and the whole room realizes who he really is. The chandeliers glowed above the marble floors, their light spilling across polished tables and crystal glasses, but the man who entered through the heavy brass doors did not look like he belonged to such a place. Alexander Vale was worth $10 billion. Yet his jacket was threadbare corduroy with frayed elbow patches, his plaid shirt faded from too many washes, his jeans loose at the knees, and his shoes scuffed and dull. To the staff at the Gilded Crown, the jewel of his empire, he was invisible. That was how he wanted it. The hostess glanced at him with a tight smile, the kind reserved for people who looked like they had wandered in by mistake, then offered him the smallest table pressed against the swinging kitchen doors. She did not ask for a reservation. She did not ask his name. She simply led him past glittering tables where couples in evening gowns and tailored suits paused to stare at him with faint disdain. Alexander accepted it all in silence. The table wobbled when he sat, the clatter of trays and the shouts of cooks spilling through the doors behind him. It was the worst seat in the house, reserved for those deemed unworthy of the prime view of the roaring fireplace and the wine wall gleaming with rare vintages. For Alexander, it was perfect. From here he could see everything. He watched the waiters glide with a grace sharpened by ambition, their smiles wider for guests in diamonds and narrower for anyone who looked ordinary. He saw the manager, a tall man in a fitted suit, leaning too close to a table of city officials, his laugh booming, his eyes sharp whenever a busboy passed. Alexander had read his name in reports, Victor Hale, but paper never captured the slickness of a man who polished his charm like a weapon. Alexander folded his hands on the table, the rough fabric of his jacket scratching against his skin. He felt the familiar weight of his disguise, not just the thrift store clothes, but the freedom they gave him. In this place, stripped of his title and fortune, he was simply another man, one who could be dismissed, ignored, or judged without mercy. It was a ritual he repeated every few months, a way to remind himself of what his empire had become beneath the glowing numbers of quarterly reports. Reports spoke of flawless service, impeccable profits, record growth, but they could not measure truth. Tonight he was not Alexander Vale, the billionaire with a penthouse office and a staff of lawyers and advisors. Tonight he was a nobody named Alex, sitting at the edge of his own creation, waiting to see how it treated someone who did not appear to matter. The noise of the room carried on without him, laughter bouncing off glass and steel, knives scraping against porcelain, corks pulled from bottles worth more than most salaries. No one came to take his order. No one refilled his glass of water. To them, he was a weed in a rose garden, and that was exactly what he needed to feel. Alexander leaned back, eyes steady, heart heavy with the question that always drove him here. Was honesty still alive in a world where everything had a price? The dining room glittered with a brilliance designed to impress. Chandeliers, scattering light across crystal glasses and polished silver, every detail carefully arranged to project perfection, yet Alexander Vale saw through it all. He sat quietly at his corner table, the hum of voices rising and falling like a rehearsed symphony, each laugh a little too loud, each smile a little too wide. Waiters moved with studied elegance, their eyes trained to weigh a guest's value not by their words, but by the brand of their suit or the sparkle of a ring. At one table, a server leaned in so close to a wealthy banker that his laugh turned into a performance, while at another table, a busboy's hesitation earned him a sharp whisper from the manager. The kindness here was never free. It was measured against tips and status, a currency more powerful than dollars. Alexander's disguise gave him the chance to feel the raw edge of truth, the kind most men like him never touched again after they reached the top. His faded jacket and worn shoes made him invisible, a shadow in a room filled with polished glass, and the invisibility stung in ways he would never admit. He had built this empire, bought this restaurant chain when it promised profit and prestige, yet here he was, treated as though his presence was an inconvenience. The hostess's painted smile still lingered in his memory, brittle as glass, her tone dripping with the belief that he did not belong. It was exactly the world he had feared his money had created, a world that polished the surface so bright that no one dared to look beneath. He studied the faces around him, couples dressed in gowns and tuxedos, businessmen hunched over their phones, politicians shaking hands with forced warmth. Their conversations carried the same emptiness he had heard in boardrooms, words crafted not for honesty, but for advantage. He wondered when he had last heard someone laugh without calculation, when a smile given to him had been real and not an act rehearsed in the mirror of ambition. The thought pressed on him with the weight of his fortune, a wealth so vast it had become a barrier rather than a bridge. Every interaction in his life was filtered through assistants, lawyers, and advisors, each person shaping themselves into what they thought he wanted them to be. No one spoke to Alexander Vale the man, they spoke to Alexander Vale the empire. At his table near the kitchen doors, the truth of that loneliness settled like a shadow across his heart. He felt the distance between himself and the room, not because of space, but because of honesty. The staff who ignored him now would rush with wine and charm if he walked in wearing a tailored suit, their kindness bought and sold in the blink of an eye. It was the same sickness he had seen in his boardroom, a sickness polished to look like success. For a moment, Alexander closed his eyes and listened to the clinking of glasses, the practiced tones of servers, the hollow laughter of guests, and he wondered if, in chasing power, he had traded away the only thing that truly mattered. The clatter of plates and the muffled shouts from the kitchen doors framed Alexander's table with constant noise, but when the young waitress approached, it seemed as though the world paused. She was not like the others who glanced at him with disdain or ignored him altogether. She moved with a quiet grace, a careful steadiness that spoke of long hours and practiced patience. Her uniform was clean but not new, the white apron faded at the creases, and her black non-slip shoes were cracked at the edges, the soles worn thin from too many double shifts. She carried herself with dignity, despite these small betrayals of struggle, her brown hair pulled into a simple ponytail, her wide eyes ringed with shadows that no amount of makeup could hide. "Good evening, sir," she said softly, her voice low but clear. "My name is Anna, and I'll be taking care of you tonight." There was no judgment in her tone, no hesitation in her smile. It was not the brittle smile of someone hoping for a larger tip, nor the painted expression of someone playing to wealth. It was genuine, gentle, and it struck Alexander in a way he had not expected. For years he had been surrounded by people whose smiles were bought and shaped, yet here was a stranger who looked at him and saw not a man in shabby clothes, not a man to dismiss, but simply a person. He nodded, studying her face, as she set a basket of bread on the table. The tremor in her hand did not escape his notice, nor did the faint crease of worry in her brow. She moved with precision, but it was the precision of someone fighting through exhaustion, someone who had long ago learned to swallow their struggles for the sake of survival. Alexander felt a strange tug of recognition, as though her quiet weariness mirrored the hollowness in his own life. He had all the wealth in the world, but she possessed something he had lost along the climb, a raw honesty that could not be faked. Anna asked if he would like something to drink, and he ordered the cheapest beer on the menu, watching for even the smallest flicker of disappointment. None came. Her smile did not falter, her tone did not change. She only nodded and said she would return shortly. Alexander watched her walk away, her shoes whispering against the polished floor, and he felt something stir within him. It was not pity, though her tired form might have invited it, but admiration for the quiet strength it took to endure, night after night, in a place where smiles were currency and dignity was often discarded. When she returned with the drink, she placed it before him carefully, her hand steady despite the weight of her fatigue. For the first time that evening, Alexander felt the edges of his loneliness soften. In Anna's presence, there was no performance, no calculation. There was only a tired young woman who still managed to treat a stranger with respect. And for Alexander, that was worth more than any polished lie. The leather-bound menu felt heavy in Alexander's hands, though he already knew what he would choose. It was part of his test, the quiet ritual he carried out each time he stepped into one of his restaurants in disguise. When Anna returned with his beer and set it gently on the table, he looked up at her with calm eyes. She stood patiently, pen and pad ready, her expression free of the impatience he had seen on the faces of other waiters who judged a guest by their clothes. Her worn shoes and the faint tiredness in her shoulders did not hide the dignity in her posture. She asked softly if he had decided, and Alexander allowed a small pause before speaking. "I think I'll have the emperor's cut," he said, his voice even. The words seemed to hang between them. Anna's eyes flickered for a moment, not with scorn, but with a question she dared not speak aloud. The emperor's cut was the most expensive item on the menu, a steak ordered for spectacle, its price $500 for a single plate. Guests who chose it usually wore tailored suits, their watches flashing with diamonds, their voices loud enough to fill the room. But this man sat in a frayed jacket with cracked boots and glasses that did not fit his face. For a brief instant, she wondered if he was playing some cruel game, or if he simply had no idea what he was asking for. Her training told her to call the manager, to ask for a credit card up front, to protect the restaurant from embarrassment. She knew the manager would have seized the chance to humiliate this guest, to remind her of the rules and of her own vulnerable position. But something in the man's gaze stopped her. There was no bravado in his tone, no mocking smile on his lips. His eyes were calm, steady, almost challenging in their quiet way. It felt less like an outrageous order and more like a test, one she sensed mattered far more than money. "How would you like that prepared, sir?" she asked, her voice steady. "Medium rare," Alexander replied without hesitation. "And a glass of the Cheval Blanc, 1,998. This time, Anna's composure almost cracked. The wine was legendary, the kind reserved for expense accounts and collectors, its value measured in hundreds per glass. Combined with the steak, this meal would climb beyond what she earned in a month of long shifts. She could feel the weight of the risk pressing down on her, the image of the manager's scowl flashing through her mind. But still, she found herself nodding. "An excellent choice," she said with a small, genuine smile. She wrote it down carefully, as though it were no different from any other order, and promised to return with his wine. As she walked away, heart pounding, Alexander watched her closely. She had hesitated, he had seen it, yet she had chosen to treat him with respect. In that moment, her quiet trust was worth more to him than the finest meal his empire could offer. Anna keyed the order into the system, her fingers trembling as the numbers glowed on the screen. The moment she pressed confirm, a notification flashed across the manager's terminal at the front of the room. "High-value order flagged. Review required." She felt the air tighten around her shoulders even before she turned, and there he was, Victor Hale, striding across the floor with the smooth arrogance of a man who believed he owned the very ground beneath his shoes. His suit was sharp but a little too tight, his tie knotted with unnecessary flair, his hair slicked back with precision. He wore a smile that never reached his eyes, and those eyes were fixed on her now, dark with irritation. "Vance!" he hissed, as soon as he reached her side, blocking her path near the wine station. "Tell me I didn't just see table 32 order the emperor's cut and a glass of Cheval Blanc." His voice was low, sharp as a knife. "Yes, Mr. Hale," Anna replied carefully, trying to keep her tone even. He leaned closer, the fake smile still plastered on his lips for the sake of nearby guests, though his words were venom. "Are you insane? Did you even look at him? He looks like he crawled out of a bus station. You didn't ask for a card up front? You didn't check anything?" Anna's chest tightened. She wanted to defend herself. to explain that the man's calm eyes had carried no hint of mockery, that something in his presence told her he wasn't what he appeared. But she knew Hale would not listen. He thrived on control, on fear, and she was one of his favorite targets. "I didn't want to insult a guest, sir," she said softly. Her eyes lowered but her voice steady. "Insult?" Hale's laugh was harsh and empty. "He insulted us the moment he walked in here. And now, when he dines and dashes, guess who pays for it? Not the restaurant, not me. You." He jabbed a finger at her chest, his whisper growing more dangerous. "That $500 steak, that $300 glass of wine, every last cent will come out of your paycheck. You're already on thin ice with me, Vance. Don't make me push you off." Her stomach knotted, fear spreading cold and sharp through her veins. She thought of her sister's textbooks waiting at home, the overdue rent notice tucked under her pillow, the pile of bills that grew heavier every week. One mistake could take everything from her, and Hale knew it. He used that knowledge like a weapon, pressing down until she could barely breathe. "Yes, Mr. Hale," she whispered, though the words tasted bitter on her tongue. He straightened, adjusted his tie, and offered a showman's grin toward the dining room. "Good. Pray he pays, Vance, for your sake." With that, he turned and strutted away, already laughing again at another table as though nothing had happened. Anna stood frozen for a moment, her pulse racing. She swallowed hard, forcing her hands to still. Whatever the risk, she would see this through. She would trust the stranger at table 32, because something told her that trust mattered more than fear. Alexander sat still, the stem of his water glass balanced lightly between his fingers, and watched the scene unfold with a practiced patience. He had seen Victor Hale's approach, the sharpness in the manager's stride, the false grin stretched thin across his face. From his corner table, half hidden by the swinging kitchen doors, Alexander could not hear every word. But he did not need to. The body language spoke volumes. Hale leaned too close, his finger pointed like a weapon, his mouth moving with clipped precision. Anna stood with her shoulders drawn tight, her head slightly bowed, her hands clasped around her order pad as though it were a shield. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. But neither did she crumble. She absorbed his wrath in silence, nodding once, then turning back to her duties with steady steps. Most people, Alexander knew, would have tried to deflect blame or beg for forgiveness. He had seen countless employees fold under far less pressure, and he did not always blame them. Fear was a powerful tool, one that managers like Hale wielded ruthlessly. But Anna was different. Her quiet dignity remained intact, even as the weight of Hale's threats pressed against her. She did not roll her eyes, did not snap in frustration, did not let her exhaustion spill into her work. Instead, she carried herself forward, back into the storm of the dining room, and served the next table with the same calm smile. Alexander felt a flicker of something unfamiliar respect, not the hollow respect that came from polished greetings and carefully worded praise, but the raw kind that rose when someone revealed their character without knowing they were being watched. He had set out tonight to test the honesty of his empire, to see whether truth still existed beneath the layers of performance, and now he saw his answer forming in the figure of a tired young waitress. He leaned back in his chair, eyes following her as she moved. She carried a tray of wine glasses with precision, her hand trembling only slightly before she steadied it. She offered bread to another table with the same soft tone she had given him, not favoring the wealthy guests over the man in thrift store clothes. Her shoes were worn to the thread, her eyes shadowed with sleepless nights, but still she gave each person dignity. Hale might command the staff with threats, but Anna carried a different kind of power, one born of resilience. Alexander sipped his water, his mind sharper than it had been in months. Every detail was etched into memory, dismissive look of the hostess, the polished lies of the dining room, Hale's sneer, Anna's courage. He remained calm, his disguise intact, his role as the invisible man unbroken. No one here knew that the quiet guest at the worst table was the owner himself, measuring them not by profit margins, but by integrity. As the clatter of dishes rose around him and the room buzzed with shallow laughter, Alexander made his choice. The true test had already begun, and Anna, without knowing it, was passing. The smell of seared meat and rich truffle butter filled the air as Anna carried the heavy tray toward the wobbly table near the kitchen doors. The Emperor's cut gleamed beneath the soft light, a dish that looked out of place in front of a man dressed in a corduroy jacket and scuffed boots. Yet she moved with the same care she would have given to any guest, her steps steady, though her heart beat fast from the encounter with the manager. When she reached Alexander's table, she lowered the tray with precise control, placing the steak before him and setting down the glass of rare wine with both hands, so not a drop spilled. Her smile was quiet, her voice calm as she said she hoped he enjoyed his meal, though Alexander saw the faint tremor in her fingers as she adjusted the fork at the edge of his plate. His eyes drifted down to her shoes, black non-slips cracked near the toes, the soles so thin he could almost imagine the cold floor pressing through them. They told a story as clearly as any ledger could, the story of endless double shifts, of hours spent standing until her legs ached, of choosing bills and medicine over small comforts like a new pair. He noticed the way she straightened her apron, worn soft at the creases, and forced her shoulders into poise. She wanted to appear unshaken, yet her hands betrayed her, trembling for just a moment before she folded them neatly against her side. Alexander thanked her with a nod, his tone steady, but his mind churned. He had walked into this place looking for honesty, and here it was, not in the polished lies of the managers or the fake smiles of the staff, but in the quiet dignity of a young woman whose very presence was proof of sacrifice. He cut into the steak slowly, savoring the flavor only in part, because his eyes kept following Anna as she moved through the dining room. She served every table with the same gentle manner, no louder or brighter for the guests with gold watches, no colder or harsher for the ones who seemed ordinary. She bent to pick up a napkin a child dropped, offered water without being asked, and moved quickly when another guest waved impatiently. From the corner, Alexander overheard the low voices of two waiters gossiping near the wine station. They spoke in hurried tones about Anna, about the endless hours she worked, about the younger sister she was raising alone after their mother's death, about the school fees that ate away at every paycheck. They whispered about the debt piling higher each month, about the bills that arrived faster than she could earn, and how Victor Hale used her desperation as leverage. Their words carried no malice, only pity, but Alexander felt the weight of them press against him like iron. He chewed slowly, his mind turning heavy. Each bite of the $500 steak seemed to lose its taste as he imagined Anna returning home at night, setting aside her own hunger so her sister could eat, counting out coins to cover bus fare, lying awake while debt threatened to crush her. He lifted his glass of rare wine, its ruby surface catching the light, and he realized that across the room stood the only person who had shown him truth all night, a woman with cracked shoes, trembling hands, and a courage that wealth could never buy. The last bite of steak was gone, the last sip of wine finished, and Alexander sat in silence for a moment, letting the hum of the restaurant wash over him. Around him, conversations rose and fell, laughter rang false, glasses clinked like signals of shallow victories, yet at his small table near the kitchen doors there was only stillness. He slid his worn wallet from the inside pocket of his jacket, the leather frayed at the edges, the kind of wallet no one would expect to carry a fortune behind it. He pulled out crisp bills, counting them with precision, the practiced hand of a man who had spent his life adding and subtracting numbers larger than most could imagine. When Anna returned with the black bill tray, he placed the money inside, exact to the cent, $867.53. There was no tip, no extra folded bill tucked in as a gesture, only the exact amount. Anna accepted the tray without hesitation, bowing her head slightly as she whispered a thank you. Her voice carried no judgment, no hint of offense, no shadow of disappointment. It was simple and sincere, the same tone she had used when setting down bread or refilling his water. To her, respect was not tied to numbers on a slip of paper. She treated him no differently, for leaving nothing more than what was required. And in that moment, Alexander felt the weight of her honesty, more than the value of his meal. At the next table, a pair of waiters exchanged glances and snickered under their breath. One muttered something about wasted effort. Another smirked about a man who would order the most expensive items and not leave a dime behind. Their words floated across the polished room like small arrows, but Anna did not flinch. She tucked the tray against her side and walked calmly toward the register, her back straight, her head high. Her shoes clicked softly against the floor, cracked soles carrying her with a dignity that no amount of laughter could take away. Alexander watched her go, his expression unreadable. To the others in the room, he looked like a man who had scraped together enough money to indulge in a single reckless night, then left without showing gratitude. They saw what his disguise wanted them to see. But he saw more. He saw the way Anna accepted the moment without complaint, the way she chose not to shame him, not to press for more, not to let greed poison her kindness. In a place where every smile seemed bought and every kindness calculated, she had given him something rare, something money could never secure. The manager's sharp eyes followed Anna from across the floor, his smirk curling as though already planning his next words to her, but Alexander remained calm. He leaned back in his chair, his disguise still intact, his test still unfolding. He had paid the exact amount to see what truth might emerge, and the result was clear. The others mocked, but Anna simply carried on with grace. That was the answer he had been seeking all along. The dining room glowed with golden light, but Alexander felt a shadow moving across his thoughts as Anna returned to clear his table. She lifted the empty plate with steady hands, her tired eyes softened by the faintest smile. He watched her carefully, and when her gaze dropped to the tray, he let his fingers slip a folded bill across the polished wood. The movement was discreet, but deliberate. The bill was heavy with meaning, more than her month's rent, a gesture that could erase at least one of the burdens that weighed on her shoulders. He did not announce it, did not make a display. He only slid it toward her, as if offering a secret he hoped she would accept. Anna paused, her hand hovering above the table. For a moment she said nothing, only looked at the folded paper resting there between them. The dining room noise carried on around her, laughter rising from the corner, the clink of cutlery like background music. But she felt only the silence between herself and the stranger in the frayed jacket. She could guess the amount without opening it. She knew the weight of bills, the difference between a single note and a bundle that could cover more than she had seen in weeks. Her throat tightened, her heart pounding with the possibility of relief, yet her pride stood like a wall inside her. Slowly, she pushed the bill back toward him, her hand firm, her eyes steady. "Respect is worth more to me than pity," she said softly, the words quiet but unshakable. Her voice carried no anger, only a gentle resolve that struck Alexander harder than any refusal ever had. Around them, a few staff members had noticed the small exchange. One waiter smirked, whispering something cruel about a fool who would reject free money. Another shook their head, muttering about pride being useless when rent was due. Yet Anna did not falter. She gathered the tray, held her chin high, and carried herself as though the rejection had cost her nothing. Alexander sat still, his eyes on her as she walked away. He had offered money countless times in his life, and nearly every hand had reached out to take it. Politicians, business partners, even friends, all eager to grasp the power of his wealth. Yet here was a young woman, exhausted, weighed down by debts, caring for a sister who depended on her, and she had refused him. She wanted to be seen not as a charity case, but as a person whose dignity was untouchable. His hand rested on the folded bill, untouched now, and he felt a strange mix of shame and admiration. The money in his pocket was endless, yet it meant nothing to her if it came without respect. In her refusal, She had given him something far greater than acceptance. She had reminded him of the value he had long since lost sight of. He leaned back, silent, the hum of false laughter filling the room, while one tired waitress showed him more truth than a lifetime of polished lies. The folded bill sat untouched on the polished wood, the air around it heavier than its weight. Anna had pushed it back across the table with quiet resolve, her soft words echoing in Alexander's mind. Respect is worth more to me than pity. It was a refusal so gentle yet so firm that it seemed to ripple beyond their small corner near the kitchen doors. A nearby couple paused mid-bite, the husband's fork hanging in the air as he glanced toward the waitress with faint surprise. At another table, a group of businessmen lowered their voices, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Within moments, the story of the refusal spread like a whisper, carried by the hum of the room. And suddenly, the entire dining hall felt the shift. The waiters slowed in their steps, some stopping altogether, their eyes darting from Anna to the shabby man in the corduroy jacket. They had seen enough nights in this place to know how things usually unfolded. Guests left money, waitresses smiled gratefully, and life carried on. But this was different. A waitress had returned money, and not a small amount, but a folded bill that everyone suspected was worth more than she would earn in weeks. The act defied the unspoken rules of the room, and for a moment even the clink of glasses seemed to fall silent. Victor Hale noticed too. He had been leaning at the host station, chatting with a wealthy couple he wanted to impress, when the small disturbance reached him. His eyes narrowed, sharp and suspicious, and then his lips curved into a sneer. To him, this was opportunity, the kind he savored. He straightened his jacket and walked toward Anna, each step deliberate, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. The staff watched as he stopped near the table, his voice low enough for discretion, but sharp enough to cut through the stillness. "Vance," he hissed, his smile plastered on for the benefit of the guests who could see. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Anna held her tray close, her shoulders squared, though her heart raced. "The guest offered me a tip," she said calmly, her tone respectful. "I declined." "Declined?" Hale's laugh was quick and bitter. "Do you have any idea how insulting that is? A guest shows generosity, and you throw it back in his face? Do you realize the embarrassment you cause this establishment?" Alexander watched quietly, his disguise protecting him, as Hale's words poured like venom. He noted the way Anna kept her voice even, refusing to argue, refusing to bow either. She stood her ground without defiance, without apology, only quiet dignity. The diners leaned in, their whispers growing. Some frowned, others smirked, enjoying the spectacle. Hale's sneer widened as he glanced around, aware that eyes were on him. "I should fire you where you stand," he muttered, his tone laced with cruel delight. "Insulting a guest is grounds for dismissal, and you know it." The room held its breath, waiting for the collapse. But Anna did not look at Hale. Her eyes lifted instead toward Alexander, and in that silent exchange, he saw both fear and strength. The moment had become a theater, and the audience leaned forward, waiting for the next line. The silence stretched long and thin across the dining room, broken only by the faint hiss of the kitchen doors behind Alexander's table. Victor Hale's smirk lingered, sharp as a blade, certain he had found the perfect moment to break the young waitress and display his power before the guests. Anna stood stiff, her tray balanced against her chest, her eyes steady but her breath uneven. The diners leaned closer, some smiling at the drama, others unsettled by the cruelty on display. It was in that heavy pause that Alexander Vale made his choice. He rose slowly from his chair, the worn fabric of his corduroy jacket catching the light as though it carried secrets. His movement alone drew attention, heads turning to follow him. But it was not until he lifted his hands and slid the thick-framed glasses from his face that the first ripple of recognition spread. Beneath the disguise, the sharp lines of his expression emerged, the calm authority of a man who had shaped skylines and controlled markets. His eyes, clear and unflinching, swept across the room with a force that stilled even the boldest whispers. When he spoke, his voice carried not the rough tone of a drifter, but the steady cadence that had filled boardrooms and interviews, the unmistakable voice of a man who commanded billions. "That will not be necessary, Mr. Hale," he said, each word deliberate, his tone calm but edged with steel. The effect was immediate. Forks clattered softly onto plates, glasses were set down, and the air shifted as realization dawned. The shabby guest, dismissed as a nobody, was none other than Alexander Vale, owner of the Gilded Crown and head of Vale Holdings. Hale's face drained of color. The smirk collapsed into a twisted mask of disbelief, his mouth opening but no sound emerging. His practiced charm, his arsenal of rehearsed excuses, failed him in the weight of that revelation. Around the room, whispers turned into open murmurs, names spoken in astonishment, recognition spreading like fire. The staff froze in place, their masks of professionalism cracking, as they realized who had been sitting at the worst table in the house. Anna blinked, her grip tightening on the tray, her heart lurching as she looked at the man she had served with quiet respect. She had not known who he was, yet she had treated him as she believed any person deserved. Now the truth stood before her, not a weary man in worn shoes, but the billionaire, whose name was etched into skyscrapers. Alexander's gaze did not falter as he turned back to Hale. "You were quick to threaten her for a gesture of integrity," he said, his voice low but carrying through the room. "Quick to sneer at someone you deemed beneath you. But what you failed to see is that character is not measured by wealth, and respect cannot be bought." The restaurant, once filled with shallow noise, held its breath again, but this time the silence belonged to him. He stood, not in disguise but in truth, and no one dared look away. Victor Hale's lips parted, his practiced smile twitching as though he could still claw his way back from disaster. "Mr. Vale," he began, his voice uneven, "this is a misunderstanding, a complete misunderstanding. The girl didn't mean any harm, but she often makes mistakes." His words stumbled over each other, thin threads of excuse unraveling before they reached the air. The diners leaned closer, some pretending to sip their wine, others abandoning all pretense as their eyes followed every twitch of the manager's face. Hale's shoulders, once squared with confidence, now hunched as though under invisible weight. Alexander stood calm, his presence steady as stone, his gaze sharp enough to strip the lies before they fully formed. "Enough," he said, and the single word cut through the murmur of the room. He reached into the inside pocket of his worn jacket, pulling free a slim leather folder that did not match the disguise. The room seemed to tilt as he opened it with deliberate care, revealing printed pages and clipped photographs. He spread them on the table, each movement precise, each piece of paper like a nail driven into Hale's coffin. "These are invoices signed under your name," Alexander said, his voice carrying the weight of fact rather than accusation. "Fabricated vendors, inflated costs, funds siphoned into accounts you believed untraceable. But they are traceable, Mr. Hale. They lead straight back to you." Hale's hands twitched at his sides, his mouth shaping words he could not speak. That can't be right. Those records are taken out of context. I only..." Alexander's eyes narrowed, his tone unchanging. "And here," he continued, sliding forward another sheet, "are statements from employees you threatened, women and men alike, coerced into silence with threats of termination. One testimony describes how you cornered Anna, leveraged her family struggles, and tried to hold her life as collateral for your fraud." A gasp rippled across the dining room, guests whispering, some covering their mouths in shock. Hale's composure cracked fully now. Sweat beaded at his hairline, his voice shaking as he tried again. "These are lies. These people want to ruin me. They're bitter. They..." Alexander did not raise his voice, but every syllable landed with crushing finality. "The only one who ruined you is yourself. Integrity cannot be faked, Mr. Hale, and tonight you proved that better than any file could. He looked once more toward Anna, who stood frozen, the tray still pressed to her chest, her eyes wide with disbelief. Then he turned back to the manager. You thought fear would protect you. You thought silence would bury your crimes. But silence ends here. Hale's knees seemed to weaken, his stance faltering, as if the strength that had carried his arrogance had drained away. He stammered again, words crumbling into fragments. No longer a man of control, but a figure collapsing under truth. The diners saw it clearly, rise and fall of a tyrant exposed not by power, but by honesty. The room was still heavy with the weight of Alexander's words. The papers spread across the table like shards of truth, too sharp to ignore. Victor Hale sagged near the wall. His slick charm dissolved into stammering fragments, his face pale and drawn. The staff hovered at a distance, their eyes wide, their hands clasped tight against aprons and trays, waiting for what would come next. Then Alexander turned his gaze toward Anna. His voice, steady and commanding, cut through the tense silence. Anna, come here. Her heart lurched, as though pulled by a string. For a moment she could not move, her legs rooted to the polished floor. She thought of the threats Hale had whispered in the shadows, the warnings that one misstep would end her career, the fear that every day she walked a line too thin to survive. Now she had refused a tip, challenged the unspoken order of the dining room, and been pulled into the storm. She swallowed hard, trembling as she set down the tray she held, her fingers brushing the edge of the wood for courage, and walked slowly toward Alexander's table. The eyes of the room followed her every step. Some diners whispered, expecting her dismissal, perhaps even enjoying the spectacle of a waitress about to lose her job in front of them. Others looked uneasy, their gazes soft with sympathy. Anna's breath came shallow, her chest tight, and when she finally stopped at Alexander's side, she kept her eyes low, unable to meet his stare. She waited for the sharp words, the final blow that would undo her. Instead, his voice came low, not cold, but warm, with a strength that made her lift her head in surprise. You stood with integrity when fear was easier, he said, his words carrying across the dining room. You treated a man with respect when you thought he had nothing. And tonight, you reminded everyone in this room that dignity cannot be bought. A murmur ran through the crowd, not of mockery, but of astonishment. Anna blinked, her eyes stinging, her throat thick with the emotion she tried to swallow. She shook her head slightly, her voice trembling as she whispered, I was only doing my job, sir. Alexander's gaze softened, though his presence remained commanding. No, he said firmly, his words echoing, you were doing far more than that. You showed courage in the face of threats, kindness without calculation, and honesty in a place that has forgotten what that means. You saw a person where others saw nothing. Her breath caught, her shoulders trembling as if the weight of years had pressed suddenly too heavy. She could not remember the last time anyone had spoken of her with respect, the last time her worth had been measured by more than bills and debts. For a moment the restaurant, the polished walls, the glittering chandeliers, all faded, and there was only the truth of his words anchoring her to the floor. Alexander placed a hand gently on the back of her chair, inviting her to stand beside him, not as a servant, but as an equal in this moment of reckoning. The room watched in silence as a billionaire praised a tired waitress, not for what she carried in her pockets, but for what she carried in her heart. The chandeliers above still gleamed with golden light, but the dining room that only moments ago had been filled with laughter and the clink of crystal now sat frozen in silence. Every fork lay forgotten, every glass untouched, as all eyes turned toward the small corner near the kitchen doors. Alexander Vale, whose name carried weight across cities and markets, stood beside a waitress with worn shoes and tired eyes. The staff held their breath, some clutching trays against their chests, others gripping the edge of tables as though anchoring themselves against a tide they did not understand. The diners who had sneered at the shabby man in the corduroy jacket now stared with open mouths, their certainty stripped away by the truth of who he was. Anna's heart pounded so loud she could hear it over the silence. She stood trembling, expecting that at any moment the balance would snap and she would be told to leave, told that she had overstepped, told that her place was not here. Instead, Alexander turned to her, his movements deliberate, his expression calm but resolute. Slowly, without hesitation, he bent one knee so he could look her directly in the eyes, lowering himself in front of everyone in the glittering hall. A billionaire who commanded skyscrapers and boardrooms now knelt before a young woman who had refused his money. A collective gasp moved through the room, the sound like wind sweeping across glass. The staff shifted uneasily, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing. Victor Hale, still pale and cornered, pressed himself against the wall, his sneer gone, his power evaporated. The diners leaned closer, drawn into the spectacle, whispering in disbelief. Some looked scandalized, others awestruck, but no one looked away. Alexander extended his hand toward Anna, his voice steady as he said, "It is an honor to shake the hand of someone who values respect above wealth." His words were clear, not spoken in secrecy, but projected so that every person in the room could hear them. The staff, who had been taught to measure every gesture by tips and fear, now saw their employer lifting the courage of one of their own. Anna's breath caught, her eyes wide and glistening. For a moment she did not move, her pride warring with disbelief, her body trembling with the weight of so many eyes upon her. Then slowly, cautiously, she set her tray aside and placed her hand into his. His grip was warm, steady, not the grip of a man performing for applause, but of someone who meant every word. The silence stretched again, heavier now, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of realization, of staff and guests alike witnessing a reversal of power they had never imagined. A billionaire knelt not to flaunt his wealth but to honor dignity, and a waitress, who had been overlooked, threatened, and mocked, was now the center of truth in the grandest room of his empire. The silence of the dining room held for only a breath longer, before the heavy brass doors swung open and the sound of polished shoes struck the marble floor. 2 men in dark suits entered first, followed by uniformed officers whose presence carried the finality of judgment. The diners stiffened, some whispering in disbelief, others leaning back in their seats as though distance might shield them from what was unfolding. The staff froze mid-step, trays clutched tightly, eyes darting between Alexander Vale, standing tall beside Anna, and the figures moving swiftly through the room. Victor Hale's face drained of color the instant he recognized the authority in their stride. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no sound emerged. One of the suited men approached Alexander and gave a small nod of respect, then turned his attention to the trembling manager. "Victor Hale," the officer said clearly, his voice echoing beneath the chandeliers. "You are under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and coercion of employees." The words cut through the room with the weight of a gavel. Hale stumbled backward, his hand rising in a weak gesture of protest. "This is a mistake, a complete mistake," he stammered, his slick tone cracked and broken. "I've been loyal to this company. I've protected its interests. His excuses crumbled as the officers closed in, their expressions unmoved, their purpose absolute. Cold steel glinted in the light as the cuffs snapped around his wrists, the final sound of authority louder than any of his words. Gasps rose from the staff who had suffered under him for years, their fear and exhaustion etched into their faces. They looked at one another, their eyes wide, unable to believe that the tyrant, who had barked orders, docked wages, and wielded threats like weapons, was being led out in disgrace. Some exchanged small, stunned smiles, others pressed hands to their mouths, and a few allowed tears to slip free, the kind that came not from sadness, but from sudden release. Hale twisted as they guided him toward the doors, his voice rising in a desperate cry. "You'll regret this, Vale. You'll all regret this." But his words carried no weight anymore, only the hollow echo of a man whose power had been stripped away. The diners who once laughed at his charm now turned their faces from him, unwilling to meet the eyes of someone revealed so completely. Alexander stood steady, his arms folded, his gaze firm. He did not need to speak further. The truth had already been spoken. Anna stood a step behind him, her hands clasped together, her heart pounding with the sight she never thought she would witness. The man who had cornered her in shadows, who had threatened her with ruin, was gone in a matter of moments. When the doors closed behind Hale, the room exhaled as one. The staff exchanged looks that shimmered with relief and disbelief, the chains of fear slipping from their shoulders. For the first time in years, they felt the air of freedom inside their own workplace. The tyrant was gone, and in his place stood something they had almost forgotten they could trust: justice. The last echo of the closing doors still lingered when Alexander stepped forward, his presence commanding every eye in the room. The guests whispered in low tones, some in awe, some in discomfort, but none of them mattered to him now. His attention turned to the staff, the waiters holding their trays tightly against their chests, the busboys frozen with empty glasses in their hands, the hostess pale with uncertainty. For years they had lived under the sharp shadow of Victor Hale, their every move judged, their every mistake punished, their every kindness reduced to performance. Alexander saw the weight of fear still heavy on their shoulders, and he knew he had to break it. He lifted his voice so it carried across the glittering hall, strong but steady, cutting through the silence. "Tonight ends the culture of fear in this place," he said, his words ringing clear. The staff shifted, their eyes wide, some glancing at each other as if to confirm they had truly heard him. "There will be no more threats, no more exploitation, no more games of humiliation. This restaurant, and every restaurant that bears my name, will no longer reward false smiles or punish honest hearts." A murmur rippled through the employees, disbelief mixed with cautious hope. Alexander's gaze swept across them, pausing on the hostess who had judged his clothes, the waiter who had laughed at his exact payment, the busboy who had flinched under Hale's barked orders. "You have been told to measure people by their wallets, to bend only toward wealth, to act as though kindness itself were a currency. That ends now. From this night forward, no guest will be valued above another, and no worker will be discarded as though they are less." He turned his eyes to Anna, who stood quietly at his side, her hands clasped together, her eyes shimmering with disbelief. "Tonight I was shown what integrity looks like," he continued, his voice softening but carrying still. "Not in fine suits or polished lies, but in a young woman who chose dignity over easy money, honesty over fear. That is the standard I expect from all of us. Not fear, not calculation, integrity." The staff began to straighten, their shoulders lifting as though a burden had been eased. Some blinked back tears, others let small smiles slip free for the first time in years. Alexander knew trust would take time, that wounds left by cruelty did not heal overnight, but he had given them the first step. He looked once more across the room, his eyes steady. "This place will be built on respect, not fear, on fairness, not exploitation. And let it be clear to everyone here, if you cannot live by those values, you will not stand in this house." The words landed like a vow, final and unshakable. The staff exchanged looks filled with awe and relief, their silence no longer born of terror but of something they had nearly forgotten: hope. The days after Victor Hale's arrest passed like the slow clearing of a storm. The staff moved differently, their steps lighter, their eyes brighter, no longer shadowed by the fear of sharp words and sudden punishments. The dining room still gleamed with chandeliers and polished glass, but beneath the glitter, something new was being built. Alexander Vale had not simply removed a corrupt manager. He had begun reshaping the heart of his empire. His first act was quiet but powerful, one that reached beyond the walls of the restaurant and into the fragile life of the young woman who had shown him more courage than any board member ever had. Anna was called to his office, a place she had never imagined standing. She stepped nervously into the tall glass building, her worn shoes almost silent against the marble floor, her hands clasped tight to steady her shaking. She expected a meeting filled with formal words and unreachable promises, yet what she found was Alexander himself, waiting not in a towering leather chair but standing by the window, his voice warm when he greeted her. He placed a folder on the desk, its weight not of paper but of transformation. "Your debts are gone," he said simply, his tone leaving no space for doubt. "Every bill, every fabricated charge, hail pressed against you, every shadow that threatened your family erased." Anna's eyes filled with tears before she could stop them, her body trembling as relief she had never allowed herself to hope for washed over her. She whispered a thank you, but Alexander only shook his head. "You owe me nothing. You earned this by standing with integrity when it mattered most." He opened the folder further, showing documents that detailed a fully funded trust for her younger sister's education. "She will finish her studies without fear of loans or unpaid fees," he continued, his voice softer now. "Her path will not be blocked by the weight you carried alone." Anna pressed her hand against her mouth, her tears falling freely. For years she had lived in survival, each day a battle between exhaustion and necessity, and now the chains were gone. But Alexander was not finished. He looked at her with the steady resolve of a man shaping more than numbers. "I am creating a new position," he said. "Director of Cultural Integrity and Employee Welfare. Its purpose is simply no worker will ever again be humiliated, exploited, or silenced in my company. And I want you to be the first to hold it." Anna stared, her breath caught, unable to understand why someone like him would choose her. "I'm just a waitress," she whispered. Alexander's eyes softened, a faint smile touching his lips. "You are far more. You are proof that courage and honesty can exist in places polished lies cannot reach. That is what this company needs." The weight of his words filled her heart with both fear and pride. She nodded slowly, then firmly, her voice steady despite the tears. "I accept." And in that moment, a new legacy began, not written in marble or money, but in dignity. Weeks passed, and the restaurant found its rhythm again, though the air inside felt changed forever. The chandeliers still poured golden light across polished tables, the wine still shimmered in crystal glasses, the steaks still arrived sizzling on heavy plates, yet beneath the surface there was something new. Laughter sounded less forced, kindness felt less rehearsed, and the staff carried themselves with a pride that had been missing for years. The fear that once haunted every corner was gone, replaced by a sense of dignity that could not be bought. On a quiet evening, Alexander Vale returned, not in disguise this time, but with the calm presence of a man at peace. His suit was simple, his watch unremarkable, his manner free of the armor of performance. He walked through the dining room, and the staff greeted him not with brittle smiles but with genuine warmth. Some bowed their heads respectfully, others offered small nods of gratitude, and all of them remembered the night everything had changed. At table 32, the seat nearest the kitchen doors, Anna was already waiting. She no longer wore the tired shoes that once betrayed her exhaustion, nor the apron that had carried the weight of her struggle. She sat with quiet confidence, dressed simply, but with a grace that came not from fabric but from newfound strength. She was no longer only a waitress. She was now Director of Cultural Integrity and Employee Welfare, a voice for those who had once been voiceless. Yet tonight she was simply Anna, seated at the table where her courage had first been seen. Alexander joined her, taking the seat opposite. Between them, on the polished wood, lay the folded bill, the same note she had once pushed back with trembling hands. Its edges were worn now, as though touched too often, a relic not of money, but of meaning. Anna's eyes fell on it, and she smiled faintly, remembering the fear that had gripped her that night, and the choice she had made. Her refusal had felt like defiance, but now she understood it had been the moment that defined everything. For a time they sat in quiet reflection, the hum of the dining room carrying around them. Then Alexander reached across the table and took her hand, his grip steady, his expression calm. His voice lowered meant only for her, but it carried the weight of truth. "The world has enough servants of money," he whispered. "What it needs are servants of truth." Her breath caught, her eyes glistening as she returned the pressure of his hand. Around them, the restaurant moved on, guests laughing, glasses clinking, staff serving with genuine smiles, unaware that at table 32, a moment of greater importance was unfolding. The folded bill remained untouched between them, not as currency but as a symbol, a reminder that dignity cannot be bought, and that even in a world polished by lies, honesty still had the power to change everything. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.